Hi everyone, this is Amy with the New Westminster Times, and this week I'm joined by Heather Mason, and I will explain who she is in one moment. So, in April of 2025, CaWsbar, or Canadian Women's Sex-Based Rights, a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that is dedicated to preserving and protecting women's sex-based rights, filed a constitutional challenge on behalf of incarcerated Canadian women to remove males from female prisons in this country. CaWsbar has lawyers funded by the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms, including Chris Fleury, James Manson, Alison Pajovic, and Darren Leung. Today, I'm talking to Heather Mason, who, like myself, is a CaWsbar co-founder. Heather is also a formerly incarcerated woman who got involved in this fight after witnessing firsthand how the Canadian government's passing of Bill C-16 affected incarcerated women. Bill C-16 resulted in a Correctional Services of Canada, or CSC, policy called Directive 100, Gender Diverse Offenders. This policy enables transgender identified males to gain entry into women's prisons simply if they say that they are women or that they identify as women. This has resulted in horrific abuses of women up to and including rape. Heather has connections inside of Canada's female prisons, and she spent years collecting their testimony on the abuses that they've suffered due to this policy. So the latest in this court case, as announced by the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms last week, is a significant victory for Canadian women. And so this is a quote from the JCCF press release. In the ruling released on May 14th, 2026, Associate Judge Catherine Moore dismissed the federal government's motion to strike the constitutional challenge. The Crown had argued that the claim allegedly lacked sufficient material facts and disclosed no reasonable cause of action. The court rejected those arguments, finding that the claim properly raises alleged violations of Sections 7, 12, and 15 of the Charter, as well as provisions of the Canadian Bill of Rights. Sections 7, 12, and 15 protect the rights to life, liberty, and security of the person, freedom from cruel and unusual treatment or punishment, and equality before and under the law. The court further concluded that it was not plain and obvious that the claim could not succeed. In a separate ruling, the court granted CaWsbar public interest standing, accepting the evidence that federally incarcerated women may be unwilling or unable to bring claims themselves because of fears of reprisals, institutional consequences, or impacts on parole decisions. The court also accepted that the case raises issues of public importance involving a vulnerable population. In its decision, the court noted evidence that many federally incarcerated women have histories of physical and sexual abuse. So I know, Heather, in CaWsbar, we've been celebrating this. It feels like a massive win. And I think something that maybe the public doesn't see is the conversations and the hours that you spend talking to these federally incarcerated women who really don't have a voice without you and the work that you've done. So maybe you can sort of tell us how you do this and what sort of connection you have to these women and the sorts of stories that you're getting from them.
Sure. Thank you, Amy. That was a good intro. It really gave a lot of information. So I've actually started speaking with women who were incarcerated or formerly incarcerated in 2019. At first, it was a lot of the women that I was incarcerated with at Grand Valley Prison for Women in Kitchener, Ontario. So they would like get out and go to the halfway house, and like the one girl I was really good friends with, basically I thought of her like my little sister. We were very close in prison, and she got out and she ended up going to the Hamilton halfway house, and Matthew Harks was there, and he was sexually harassing her, stalking her, and he actually was revoked and sent back to Grand Valley Institution for Women because of being inappropriate in the harassment that he was doing to her, as well as the comments and attitude that he had towards staff there. And I was speaking with her, and she told me what was happening. And then I had spoken to a couple more women who I was in the halfway house, and I realized that there are a whole bunch of women that had stories. And like Amy, I've had my experiences as well. Like I had an experience actually in provincial jail with a prolific serial pedophile as well. Not just a pedophile. He likes women, he likes young girls, he likes teenagers, anything that he can get his hands on. And my experience there was I was taken into a cell to be strip searched for contraband. And he was in the cell beside me, and they went to remove him out of that cell while they were strip searching me. And he moved over so that he could peer into my cell while I was naked. And a male guard had to grab him and pull him away. So not only did the sex offenders see me naked, but so did the male correctional officer. And so, like, that was my very first experience. And then when I was in Grand Valley, I had even more experiences. So it really started in 2019, speaking to the women that were previously incarcerated. And then I kind of moved on to finding ways to speak to women that were incarcerated all across Canada. So I don't know if you remember, but I did a survey in, I want to say it was summer 2021. And I sent this survey to every single criminalized woman I knew and asked them to share it. And I ended up having like 80 something responses. So I ended up getting in touch with a lot of women across Canada, and they provided me with a lot of insight and stories that had happened to them. And then as well, because I'm an advocate for federally sentenced women, women are able to add me to their PIN list. So what people don't realize is typically an inmate is, you have to get permission to add people to your PIN list, and you have to have a very good reason to have them there. And if they're on somebody else's PIN list that's in another federal institution or even your own institution, they technically do not deny that due to security risks, but because I'm an advocate, I'm allowed to be on lots of different women's PIN lists. So then I started getting phone calls from women, but I also will get emails and text messages from their families. So a lot of their fathers, their mothers, their aunts, their sisters, they all reach out to me. And it just kind of escalated. The more people that heard about me, the more people that reached out. But there have been so many different things that I've tried over the years to gain contact with women all across Canada.
And so a PIN list is a short list of persons that you're allowed to have contact with when you're incarcerated. Is that how you would describe that?
Yeah, so in prison, you have payphones in your, okay, so Grand Valley Institution for Women, for people that don't know, I basically describe it as a gated community, except the gate never opens. So there are 14, 14 homes, I want to say, and they are like little cottages. They have like 9 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, a kitchen, a laundry room, a dining room, a living room, a garden, a porch, and we have a payphone that's inside that home. But it's not like a normal payphone. You have to have a calling card, and the calling card is given by the institution. And you're only able to call numbers that are pre-approved. So you have to submit a form with the person's first name, last name, date of birth, address, relationship, and then the prison will call that person. And when they call you, they won't tell you who they're calling for. You have to guess who has added you to their PIN list, like first and last name. And if you can't give them the first and last name, then they don't add you to the PIN list. So in my situation, it's been hard because I have like 4 women that are going to add me. And like, I'm like, it could be this person, this person. Like, so it's a little
Yeah.
difficult when I have a lot of women trying to add me at once. But yes, so they're pre-approved numbers of people that you're allowed to call.
Okay. I know when I try to talk about this issue to people, it sounds so incredible. They don't even believe, like you talked about this, Matthew Harks, who I think goes by Madeline Harks now. And there's another one out here in British Columbia where I am, Tara D'Souza, who was previously Adam D'Souza, who was at one point Canada's youngest dangerous offender. He raped an infant. He murdered a toddler. He now resides for years in this women's prison where there's actually a mother baby program. And people just find it unbelievable. Like, I can't even believe this is happening. Or if they do believe, like you could say, you can go and Google this guy, it's true. Then they are sometimes like, well, that must just be a one off. That can't be the actual policy. This can't be something that's happening regularly, repeatedly, or something that people are turning a blind eye to. And that what you've done in connecting with all of these women is you found and you saw yourself, like, that is absolutely not the case. This is happening every single day. And without you, and without the Justice Center funding these lawyers and this constitutional challenge, these women wouldn't have a voice to say what's happening to them on the inside. Maybe you can speak to some of the terrible things that you've heard about what's happening to women inside of our prisons every day.
Yeah, and I also want to feed off of what you were saying. It's extremely hard to get information out of prison. So we touched on the PIN list. And then also, you can't just go and visit. Again, you have to be pre approved for the visits. And you have to have an established relationship. So their only other means of communicating with the outside would be to buy stamps and have letters and envelopes and send mail. They don't have access to the internet. So they're very limited on how they're able to get anything out. And unfortunately, with letters, so when we write a letter, we have to go up to the main compound, like where all the program rooms are and the offices, like the actual jail, and you put your letter unsealed into a mailbox, and then the correctional officers will collect that from the mailbox, and then they go and read that letter. So a lot of women don't want to put any of this type of information in a letter to send out because they know that correctional officers are going to read it. There's no privacy, right? And they run the risk of retaliation, upsetting guards, and just making their time so much harder. So a lot of them don't want to write in letters. But yes, there's been all sorts of things. So there has been criminal harassment, sexual assault, physical assaults, bullying. There's been a whole bunch of different incidents all across Canada. There have been women that have been impregnated. There have been women that have been taken out for abortions. There's a lot of psychological harm as well. Like you mentioned earlier, a lot of the women that are incarcerated are victims of domestic violence, of historic sexual assault as like children, even as adults. So it's very traumatic for them to now be required to live with a male. And on top of that, to be living with a male who is also a registered sex offender or a designated dangerous offender. So it's very traumatic. There's a lot of like spiraling, getting like depression and just a whole bunch of psychological mental health issues that go along with that as well. And then when I've seen women have been sexually assaulted before, there is no outlet for them. So there isn't services really available to talk about what has happened to you. So then they're triggered and then they lash out, and they may like get into an argument or a fight with another woman on compound because they don't know how to deal with what has happened to them. And then they are punished by being sent to maximum security. So then they're escalated in their security clearance, which means now they have less activities and less freedom, and they have to work their way back out of max to get onto medium compound. And this is especially important when you have women that are in the mother-child program. Typically, most of the women's prisons in Canada, the mother-child program is actually in minimum security. Fraser Valley, they do have it on medium compound. So these women don't stick up for themselves, say anything, because they're afraid that if they do get in trouble and they're moved up security classifications, then they're at risk of losing their child to CAS if they don't have family, right? So they have to be on their best behavior. So that's why I don't know if you saw the article where a woman was sticking up for another woman in Fraser Valley because that Tara guy, Adam, he was leering at and intimidating and threatening the mother who had a child, and she couldn't do anything. So another woman stood up for her, and he actually like threw her and like bruised or broke her ribs. And then she is the one that got in trouble because she called him a pedophile. And the guard said basically she was asking for it.
Wow. It's absolutely and disgusting to understand this. I know there was another story, and I don't know how much you can say about it, but we already know that Indigenous women are overrepresented in our prison population in Canada. And there was a case with an Indigenous woman who reported a rape or a sexual assault with a trans identified male, and that resulted in her being put in solitary confinement. And then it seems as though these males who are, that you can also get into this argument, are these men, do they actually genuinely believe that they're females, or are they just identifying as females so that they can go to sort of a lesser security prison, because men and women's prisons are very different. But I mean, that's ultimately besides the point, because the ultimate point is that no males whatsoever, no matter how they identify or believe themselves to be, belongs in a female prison. And maybe you can explain that to people, like why there's such an incentive for predatory males, and a lot of the ones who do want to identify their way into female prisons, they're a lot of them are sex offenders. Why are these predatory males so interested in gaining access to female prisons?
So you touched on it a bit there, and there is a big difference between security measures between women's prisons and men's prisons. And an example of this actually is one of my protests a couple of years back. We did it outside Grand Valley Prison for women, and I actually brought a couple of my buddies from home who have been incarcerated before. And we got to the prison, and they're like, "Where's the prison?" And I'm like, "Right here." And they're like, "What do you mean? This is the prison?" They're like, "Where's the fence?" And I'm like, "This is the only fence." And they're like, "I could scale that in 2 seconds." And I'm like, "Yeah, I know you could. And that's why you have more fences, higher fences, and stronger fences. The women don't." Right? So they were blown away with the security measures at the women's prison and didn't even realize that we were at the prison because it's so different from the men's. So with the men's, you'll have like guard towers, and they have like 90 millimeter gas launchers, and they have the way they even handle disputes or standoffs or any of that type of behavior in the men's prison is a lot different than if that were to happen in the women's prison. They're very more, not that they are, but they're supposed to be more trauma informed with the way that they react and handle the women there. But the security measures completely different. And on top of that, men's prisons, there are a lot of like, okay, so there's like a super max. Women don't have super max. And then there'll be like max max or max medium or medium max, right? Like, so inside your three security levels, which are typically minimum, medium, and max, men have a whole sliding scale, right? So women's prisons are basically like camps for men. They're minimum security, right? So most men who are incarcerated are unable to make it to those camps because of their crime, their risk, etc. So since women's prisons don't have a lot of the different sliding scale for security and security measures, this is a walk in the park for them, right? In the men's prison, they're not living in a cottage. They're living in cells, right? Bars. And in women's prisons, there are no cameras in the homes. So the guards do a walkthrough once every 2 hours. So you have a lot of freedom there that you do not have in the men's prisons. You also are able to cook your own food. The knives are chained to the wall. Like that's not, you're not going to find that in the men's prison. Like we garden, we do all sorts of things. So there's a lot of freedom there. And on top of that, you're now living in a home that doesn't have cameras, and you know the guards don't come through for 2 hours. So you have access to these women. And it's he said, she said, because there are no cameras. So if there are no other women around in the home, there's nobody there to back up what went down. And like I said, they take more of a trauma approach with the women because of the high victimization and abuse and assault that these women have gone through, that they treat them a lot different. So when one of the males that was at Grand Valley had a standoff and barricaded himself in the gym, like they were bringing him pizza to try to negotiate with him. Like they're not doing that in the
Wow.
men's prison. And there are less women than there are men. So in the men's institutions, you're going to have way, way, way more men that are locked up trying to go for parole. So your parole date is going to be pushed back because you have to do complete mandatory programming in order to go for parole. So if you don't get this mandatory programming completed, you do not get to go for parole. Well, getting into that mandatory programming is harder because there are so many people ahead of you that need to get in. Whereas in the women's prisons, there's less women. So you're able to complete that programming a lot quicker and therefore schedule a parole hearing and go for parole way sooner than you would be in the men's prison. On top of that, a lot of these men are dangerous offenders. Okay, so they have this designation. They don't have a release date. They have an indeterminate sentence. They could be in there for 7 years. They could be 14, 21. They could be there for the rest of their lives. So if they have been denied parole, don't have a release date, and don't think that they're ever going to get out of prison, then they're going to go and live with women because now they have access to women, and otherwise they'll never ever get the chance to be that close to women.
It sounds just so insane. There are clearly multiple incentives for predatory males to identify as women and gain access to not only like a more comfortable living situation, barricade yourself, get offered pizza rather than maybe getting tasered and hauled back to your cell or solitary confinement. You get to live in like a camp setting rather than behind bars. It's just, if there's a loophole, that like bad men are going to take advantage of that, and it's exactly what's happening. And I think you've talked about this before, but it's hard. We know a lot of the stories because of the work that you've been doing to connect with these women, but in some ways we don't even know the full extent because the data, is it true that CSC isn't releasing all of the transfer information or telling the public about how many males are moving into women's prisons?
Yes, so they don't freely give you information. You definitely have to fight for it. So you would have to submit an access to information and privacy request, and it's a minimum of 30 days. They usually take longer than that to give you the information. A lot of the times they'll tell you that they don't have that data, they don't keep that data, they don't have that document. So you really have to learn how to play their game and know what it is that you need to ask for. And on top of that, when you do get something returned, it's redacted. And most of the times you really have to fight to get it unredacted, which means you have to go somewhere else, right? Like the Officer Information Commissioner, I've said that backwards, but anyways, to have that unredacted. So you don't know a lot of what is going on, and it's hard to get that information.
It's very disturbing. And that's why I think what you've done is so incredible. Like these are women who already have so many of their rights and freedoms taken away from them. And this is just like a further way that they're, not only have they lost their liberties, but now when they're bringing males, that they're caged with male rapists, and they've lost their safety, their privacy. I think it amounts to torture. It's just completely insane. And then to think that our federal government tried to quash CaWsbar's lawsuit is incredibly disturbing, and I think goes to show that we need to do a lot more public education about what is actually happening to these women. Something that a lot of people will say is, well, what are you supposed to do with these men who identify as women, or the trans women prisoners? They're not safe in male prisons. What do you say when people ask you that question?
It's interesting when people say that because CSC has released data on this, and 94% of men in their custody who identify as women started identifying as women after they were incarcerated. So if they're really unsafe in men's prisons, why do 94% of them start identifying as the opposite sex once incarcerated? So why are they not identified in society where apparently it's a lot safer? So it doesn't really add up. It doesn't make sense. And on top of that, we do not need to put women at risk of male violence. We do not need to put them at risk of sexual assault. And, I hear all the time people try to justify and say, well, women can be sex offenders or sexually assault women too. But I'm sorry, I do not have to worry about pregnancy or abortion if I were sexually assaulted by a woman. That adds another layer onto an already traumatic event. And
Absolutely.
there
Yeah.
are things that can be done to make it safer for them. And that is, there are pods, wings, ranges on all of the men's prisons. Well, not all, but a lot of them that are underutilized or not utilized at all, that could be made into gender diverse ranges. And there are jails across Canada that do actually have those types of ranges. And we can tailor them to meet their unique needs that are different than the needs of women. And therefore, they would be safe, women would be safe, they would still have access to all the amenities that are at that prison, and they would not have to deal with any of the men that are there.
Yeah. And you talk about, yeah, there sometimes is assaults between women in women's prisons, but and you mentioned the pregnancy, abortion. The other thing is just male strength. Men on average are a lot bigger and stronger than women. It's a completely unequal fight, literally, between man and women in prison. It's inhumane. That's why we have separate prisons to begin with, is that men and women are different. Like, there's a reason for this. And I struggle to understand the complete lack of empathy that people demonstrate when they feel more sympathetic towards a man who, like you said, 94% of these men begin to identify as women once they get into prison, which doesn't make any sense. If they are genuinely believing that they're trans, why are they suddenly discovering their identity behind bars? It seems highly suspicious to me. What do you think? There's still a long ways to go with this lawsuit, and I think in the meantime, there's so much more public advocacy that needs to be done. But have you heard anything from women, especially in the last week since CaWsbar got this public interest standing and the lawsuit's going ahead? Are you hearing anything from the inside yet about women being grateful or appreciative?
So I missed the last phone call that I got. So I'm hoping that they call back because unfortunately I can't call them, right? So
Oh,
I had my ringer off on my phone and then I was like, oh no, I missed the call. But I am waiting to hear back from one of my friends as well that's inside. It's hard for them to hear about anything that's going on. So if it's not on mainstream media, they don't hear about it unless one of their family members has said something to them. And actually, Grand Valley keeps sending me back all the stuff I mail. So I try to print
Oh,
off like the National Post articles on the Charter Challenge or somebody else's article on it, and I send it in, and then they send it back and tell me that you're not allowed to print off newspaper articles and send them in. And if I want to send them
wow.
in, I have to have the actual like journalist or company send it to them. So they make it very difficult for me to get information in to them. Um, but I'm excited to be able to talk to them when I do like answer their phone calls.
Yeah, that's wild. I think it's such a reality that most people will never understand. And of course you do, having been incarcerated, but just the level and degree that your freedom can be removed from you. And that's partly why I find it so horrifying. Like, this is an extra degree. There's already, a lot of these women have these horrific histories of childhood abuse. And most of incarcerated women, including yourself, maybe you can talk about your story, it's not for violent crimes. A lot of men are in prison for violent or sexual crimes, and a lot of women, it's, drug related, not violent. And yet here they are, locked up and caged with violent men. So maybe you can share a little bit about your story too, and maybe how that changed your perception about incarcerated women as a whole.
Yeah, so I was incarcerated for drugs. I took a plea deal. So I pled guilty to trafficking of fentanyl. The interesting thing about my story is that I had a co-accused. It was a guy from out of town. He was a drug dealer and he used to come down with the drugs. And I was like the middleman. So if I helped him move his stuff, then I would make some for free. And because fentanyl is so expensive, that's really the only way you're able to keep up with your habit and not be dope sick. So it was actually his drugs, not mine. And he walked on all the charges. So part of my plea deal was you plead guilty, you get 3 years, your co accused walks. If you take it to trial, then they're going to ask for 5 to 6 years. And I just wanted to get it done and over with, and I wanted to get out for my kids. And little did I know they were making that plea deal for my co-accused to walk because he was actually being investigated for a murder outside of a Brampton nightclub at the time. He was an
Wow.
accessory after the fact for the murder. So they wanted him out so that they could follow him and find out who else was involved and all of that type of stuff. So like now the plea deal kind of makes sense to me. But that's what a lot of the women inside as well. They'll have a co-accused and they plead guilty because they feel that they could get less time than say their boyfriend or the person that they're with. You see that happen quite a lot. So there, a lot of the women that are inside are for drugs. There's also fraud. Like I was in with a woman, and actually we were in the halfway house together too. And she was in because she frauded the company she worked for because she needed money for cancer, well, chemo basically for her dog. Um, and
Oh,
then
wow.
there's, yeah, I know. I was like, what? And there are some women that are in for violent crimes, but when you actually look at their violent crimes, that they're in because they murdered an abusive boyfriend, or they murdered a boyfriend who was sexually assaulting their children, or um, like if you look into the background of why that crime happened, you understand that it was not because they broke into somebody's house at night to try to rape them or,
Yeah.
like that type. So it's actually pretty interesting. A lot of the women are in there for navigating poverty and abuse, a lot. And there are also a lot of women in there that shouldn't be in there because they have severe mental health issues, but unfortunately, they don't have the mental health care that we should have for these to support these people. Like there's a lot of schizophrenia and other types of serious mental health in there that have led them to criminality. Whereas if they had the proper supports in community, then that possibly would have never happened. So it is really sad. There's also a lot of women in there that are like developmentally delayed, which is
Mm,
really sad because it's like you're locked up with like 14-year-olds.
yeah.
I feel like they shouldn't be in there. Again, a lack of community supports for those women. And one of the women who was sexually assaulted by uh, a sex offender, she was developmentally delayed as well. And in fact, after the women on compound found out that she was sexually assaulted, they tried to lock that guy out of the house and he couldn't get into the house. So he went to the guards and the guards came to the house and said, "You have to let him in. And if you don't, we're going to put bullying in your paperwork." And what that
Wow.
means is that that will go into the paperwork that goes to the parole board, which if you have bullying in your paperwork, that could prevent you from getting parole.
Wow. It's like this that it just adds a layer to the horror that these women are experiencing to know that they have these issues, and especially like developmentally delayed women having to deal with predatory males and being punished for speaking out. It's the same thing sort of happens on the outside where people who oppose gender ideology are canceled in very different ways. Like you can lose your job, you can be socially ostracized, but when you're on the inside, what that looks like is your parole is denied. You like the consequences are a lot more severe and harsh, and there's, so few people aware of or standing up for these women. I'm curious, in terms of the CSC guards, what was your perception? How many of the guards are sort of gender critical or opposed to this versus how many buy into it and don't see an issue with the fact that they've got men coming into the prisons that they work at?
I say that it's mixed. A lot of the women do not like it because they have to strip search them, right? So I've had quite a few guards that have told me that they hate it because they know that this person's not a woman, and that they get erections every time they're strip searched and they're forced to do it and they're not allowed to say anything. And then there are also men that absolutely hate it. It's really mixed. There's others that they're completely fine with it. But especially in the women's prison scenario, they don't have the necessary tools to handle the increased security risk, the violence that comes from these men. And the guards union has actually protested outside Joliet a few years ago. They wanted an increase in security measures such as 40 millimeter gas launchers to be able to accommodate the transfers that are coming into the women's prisons because they feel like they're being put at an increased risk of harm.
Wow. It's like, doesn't that just speak for itself? Isn't that's such a condemnation of the policy that that the guards would say we're not even safe doing our jobs anymore because of these violent, predatory males being moved into women's prisons. It's so hard to believe that this is the reality in Canada, and that CaWsbar is, sort of being framed as we're the bigots that want to harm these vulnerable trans women, when in fact what we're doing is we're trying to stand up for the most vulnerable women, arguably, in the entire country. What would you say in terms of how, kind of as a final message, how can Canadians support this cause, and what should they be doing, whether it's like financial or even just talking to others? What should Canadians be doing?
Financial help is always extremely helpful, because I help provide women with like money for stamps and envelopes and that type of stuff so that they're able to get their message out. And then also it's helpful for like planning the protests and traveling and buying new signs or gas. For all the advocacy work that goes into it, it's helpful because then I'm not spending my own money to go around and try to do all of these things. But also, it's really important that people that know something reach out and speak up. So whether that's reaching out to me and telling me their story, or putting me in contact with somebody who does have some information, or even reaching out directly to our lawyers. So they can reach out directly to the Justice Centre, to Charter Advocates Canada, specifically Chris Fleury, and you can tell them your story, or you can put them in contact with your daughter or your sister or your niece or your child who is incarcerated in a woman's prison or was incarcerated in a woman's prison, and tell their story. The more women that come forward and provide information, the better it will turn out for all women who are locked up right now, and for the women that are going to be locked up in the future.
Yeah, thank you so much, Heather. I'll put links on the video to, I think you have a fundraiser page for the work you do, and I'll add one for the Justice Center and for CaWsbar as well, if people want to check any of those out. And do you have any final thoughts you want to give before we wrap up today?
Also, I should mention that CaWsbar does have a prison research team that I lead. So you could always reach out to CaWsbar and join us and fight with us. You can join the prison research team and help me with the ATIPs and the parole documents and all that information gathering, and just participate in all of our events, like our reality-based Women Unite events that are so much fun. And I'm really excited for the next one that's coming up. But there are so many ways that you could get involved with CaWsbar and help the work that we do.
Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me today, Heather.
Thank you, Amy.